the idea of democracy from which you have a certainty that somehow you can decide on who is your president and who will represent you is completely demolished. And you understand that that certainty was an illusion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Modern Art. Thank you for being here today. We're very, very excited for you to be here for the Contenders 2019 and for this screening of Edge of Democracy. We'd like to thank Netflix for helping to make this possible. We'd also like to thank our media sponsor this year, Hollywood Reporter. Now, I do have a very, very special treat, but before we begin, I want to please ask everyone to turn off your cell phones. No talking during the movie, turn them off now. Leave them out for the entire show. And now, everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Spike Lee.
Thanks for coming out. How's everyone doing? Is Brooklyn in the house? Worldwide. Let's not call out neighborhoods, please, unless you say Fort Greene. Thank you for coming out. This film from the great country, Brazil, gives us another look at the rise of fascism. It's not just here, it's global. And it's headed by Agent Orange. I don't call him by his name. And I was thinking about this. There's a very good chance if he gets impeached, he might not want to leave. Then what happens? So, to quote the title of a very great film, this is a year of living dangerously. So I want to bring up Petra, come on up, the director of this film. Give it up, please. Take the mic.
Thank you so much, Spike Lee. From Do the Right Thing to When the Levees Broke and Black KK Klansman, I've been in love with the cinema through your films and understood race and class and the power of filmmaking through them. So it's an honor to have you here. Thank you, MoMA. Thank you, Netflix. Thank you for my team who is here. This is a film that came from a huge shock and scare in 2016 and perceiving how Brazilian democracy, which had many of defaults, became in extreme danger with an impeachment that then led to the prison of Lula and to the election of Bolsonaro. And I was lucky enough to be able to document that since the beginning with my team. And there are so many parallels with what is happening to the United States, and hope you can stay for the Q&A so we can discuss these parallels and these dangerous times we're living and what we can do about it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Alison Bales. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon. I hope you all feel roused to action after seeing that. We're very excited to welcome the filmmaker of the film you've just seen. Please give a nice, warm round of applause to Petra Costa.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. And congratulations on a marvelous film that manages to encapsulate so much, but what it hasn't included is what happened a week ago. Lula has been released from prison. Could you talk about that and what that means for you personally as well as the country?
Well, first I just wanted to thank the MoMA for having the film here and all the curators, and Netflix, Spike Lee and Brenda and Allison. Thank you very much. Lula's release means a lot for the reestablishment of the rule of law in Brazil, because constitutionally, Brazil gives people the right to exhaust their appeals before they are imprisoned. That was revised in 2016 in the midst of Car Wash, which was the corruption investigation that led much of this crisis. And the Supreme Court then decided, one of the judges changed his opinion right after, in 2017, but it has been delaying ever since to vote again. And finally they did, and that's the reason why Lula was released, together with other people who had been imprisoned unconstitutionally, according to certain interpretations. And his imprisonment, of course, means much more than that, because he was imprisoned months before the election, where he was the front runner.
But he cannot run again, I understand, now. He cannot run at this point.
No, at this point he cannot run again. There is a possibility, because of leaks that happened in June of this year, that gave some evidence to what the judge, the lawyer of Lula in the UN already says in the film, which is, how is it possible for a judge to be both the judge and the prosecutor in a case? How is that a fair trial? So leaks appeared in June with messages where Judge Moro was allegedly coordinating the actions of the prosecutors and saying what to do in each step of the trial, and how Lula also should not be able to give an interview prior to the election, because they were afraid that the Workers' Party could win the election. And these leaks have been massive, and there's a possibility that the Supreme Court will judge the nullification of the entire trial, and in that case, he could run. What is complicated about Lula's case is that everyone has an opinion, and people think he's guilty or not. And what is important, and it was a learning process for me in making this film, is that our opinion really doesn't matter. What matters is the rule of law and the actual proofs, and that is what needs to be reestablished in Brazil.
Does he still have a really high approval rating? Because it seems to me that the man he appointed to be his successor, presumably with the same political ideas, part of the Workers' Party, his approval rating was terrible, and he lost to Bolsonaro. So it's more about the man than the ideas at this point? Is it Lula, the figurehead?
Not terrible. It was a 10% difference. I think he had 40%, and he was quite unknown to the country before. So Haddad, he's not very charismatic, and the problem in Brazil, as in many countries, I think here as well, is the idea of succession, right? There are charismatic leaders that come, and then who succeeds them. And in Brazil, and in most of Latin America, it's been quite a tragedy. And I think Lula is not just about the man, it's also about the ideas and what was achieved in the years that he was in power. The fact that 30, 40 million people rose out of poverty and misery changed the idea of what it means to be a Brazilian citizen to many people. Today, public universities in Brazil have a majority of black people. A few years ago, there were like less than 10% black people in public universities in Brazil. That changed the shape and the social fabric of society, and that's part of what I discovered in this film was the reason of some part of the revolt against that change. It's a slave-based society, and there are people that want it to continue to be a slave-based society.
Right. Let's get to the nuts and bolts of you making this film, because watching the film, you had such amazing access. I couldn't believe you seemed to be everywhere at once. Did you have cameramen shooting, or were you everywhere? Were you literally everywhere that your camera went? Or did you acquire a lot of footage? It was extensive.
We divided ourselves, and part of our crew is here. Moara Passoni, Thiago Pavan, Shane Boris, and we were really giving all of our soul for this to happen. So I was very inspired in the Battle of Chile by Patricio Guzmán, which documented the coup in Chile in the 70s. And in that film, he really manages to be everywhere. He is in the streets, in the Congress, and in the presidential palace. And that served as a map for us. We wanted not to make a film about Lula, Dilma, Bolsonaro, but Brazilian society and trying to be at its pulse. So we were really trying to be in the streets whenever there would be a protest, following in the Congress, and then when the moments that we knew were going to be crucial, we had multiple teams in the pro and against impeachment, inside the Congress, trying to get into the presidential palace. Of course, we also were very lucky to be able to have access to the footage of Stuckert, who was Lula's photographer for 10 years. But it was a huge endeavor. We thought this film was at first just about the impeachment. And as soon as the impeachment finished and we had filmed all of it and we were starting to understand that material, then Temer scandals came up. I think it was at that moment where House of Cards tweeted, "We can't compete." and then the film was also about Temer and his ghosts. And then Lula was imprisoned. And then Bolsonaro was elected. And that took 3 years. It was 1,001 days, actually.
Wow. And Lula and Dilma let you were the fly on the wall. You followed them around. They didn't have any qualms about letting you be so close to them, seeing them in every moment.
That took a long time. In March, March of 2016, I wrote them a letter, which later I learned they never read. And then every person I met in Congress, I kept asking for help, as, do you know them? And also Temer and Inácio, and could you introduce me? Could I get an interview? And I was like, it's impossible. She's going through an impeachment. He's going possibly to be imprisoned. They won't have time. Until eventually I managed to sneak into a bus full of historians that were going to have a meeting with Dilma in the presidential palace. And there I got to meet her for the first time and handed her a DVD of my first film, Elena, and said, could I please interview you here? I've been here for months just wanting to interview you. And she said yes. So we were granted an interview. It was very formal. It didn't even make it to the film. But from there, we established a point of connection, and the access was possible. And months later, I'm in the car with her, as you see in the film. And with Lula, the process was similar. Bolsonaro gave us access immediately.
But as you said, that was before he was elected.
Yes.
But your mother is here tonight. I saw her. Is she here? In here?
She's Liane, where are you?
She's hiding at the back. With your family's history, did Bolsonaro know who you were, the child of activists? And
I don't know, but when he gave me that tour in his office, it felt like he sensed it, because he says precisely that people like my parents should have been killed at that moment. But I don't think he knew. And we had just met in the corridors, and I accompanied him right after he had voted when he became internationally famous for having dedicated his vote to the man responsible for Dilma's torture. And I caught him right after that, and I accompanied him to his office, and he showed his office, and I don't know if you noticed, but he shows the pictures of only the presidents during the military dictatorship, and says, these are the Brazilian presidents. Who came after that weren't really presidents, I think.
yeah, I think we got that. So at what point did you know you were going to weave in your personal story? Because I think that's what sets this film apart for me. I mean, I've never seen a film that is so poetic about politics and that balances the poetry of your life, and your voice and your writing is so beautiful. You know, at what point did you know you were going to tell a personal tale, but a tale of Brazil's political history?
My first films are all personal. My first short is about aging through this and death through the story of my grandparents. Then my first feature documentary, Elena, is about the story of grief and trauma through the story of my sister who came to the States in the 90s trying to become a film actress and died of suicide. Then my second film, Olmo and the Seagull, is about what happens in a woman's mind while she's creating a human being inside her belly, a very underrepresented but widespread phenomenon. And so I'm very interested in, I think, in how the personal is political before, but I think in this film the equation shifted and the political became utterly personal. It always is, but for me, it became clear that it was hard to talk about anything else but what was happening in a national level in Brazil. It became a trauma in so many people's lives to understand that the idea of democracy, from which you have a certainty that somehow you can decide on who is your president and who will represent you, is completely demolished. And you understand that that certainty was an illusion, that your vote can be ripped apart and manipulated through so many interests. And it was traumatic to me in a physical way. Like, when this process happened, every day I woke up with nausea, vertigo, deep sadness, and I was interested in, and I thought it was something of my country at that moment. And then when Brexit happened in June, and then Trump's election later that year, I started to read many people's. There was a guy from England who said, "How do you feel with Brexit?" And he said, "I feel like being punched in the face, but very slowly." And I was like, yes, exactly, that's how I feel. And precisely that feeling is what I'm interested in investigating, the relationship between an individual and his or her own democracy, and the trauma that comes from feeling that is destabilized. I think it's something that many people have felt throughout history and in different parts of the globe, but it's hitting us in a different way at this moment.
I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, so raise your hand. There you go, right here at the front.
Is Lava Jato completely closed down now with Bolsonaro in power?
I think it has been weakened. I think they say that it's happening, but there have been interferences. For example, the general prosecutor today, before they used to be chosen as the first in the list that the prosecutors themselves would name. And during the governments of Lula and Dilma, that's kind of a rule that they established. And Bolsonaro decided to choose a person out of his own accord, which some people say is just putting in the drawer any investigation. So, and there's also been changes in the federal police. So there are changes, important changes that are happening that have made the judiciary less impartial.
How do you view the role of the United States during these events in Brazil's history?
Well, it's something that needs to be investigated, and there's a whole film to be done just about that investigation. In 2013, when the protests happened in favor of the impeachment, soon after there were right-wing social groups that appeared. One of them is called MBL, Movement Free Brazil. That group has a leader who was funded by Students for Liberty, Koch brothers, for example. And Bannon is close to Bolsonaro and his sons, and he recently said, and he was speaking to them prior to the election and giving instructions, I believe, and he recently said that he thinks Lula is the biggest threat to the global right-wing project, and that after Obama left politics, Lula is the biggest leader of the globalist movement. And so also if you look at who benefited from what happened in Brazil, there's been, Petrobras has been more and more privatized, our national oil company. And also the gun industry is a huge beneficiary. With one of the first actions of the new government was to make it easier for anyone to acquire a gun. So there are corporate interests that need to be investigated and how they actually acted throughout this process.
Has making the film changed your opinion on democracy and the future of democracy? Do you still feel positive about it, or do you feel that corporate interest and campaign financing is never going to be separate from a democratic process?
There are some people who say there's no democracy. There are different degrees of oligarchy. And unfortunately, I think today that is true. I think unregulated capitalism has hijacked most democracies, and I think that's the reason for these bursts and protests around the world. People, and why unsatisfaction with democracy has grown so much. In Brazil, 10 years ago, 50% of the people were satisfied with democracy. Now 90% of the people are unsatisfied with democracy in Brazil. In Greece and in Mexico as well, I think we're high up in the unsatisfaction. And so I think big changes need to happen also to democracy. The survival of democracy is linked as well to our survival as a species, to how are we going to deal with this fact that there are corporations that have killed and are killing our ability to exist in the planet and killing our ability to decide who we have as a president?
I think we have time for one more question. So whoever gets the microphone is the lucky person.
Hi, I would love to hear your opinion about what is happening in Latin America, like Argentina elections, Chile, Bolivia, and how this affects, and how is this connected with Brazil, and how this affects with the global democracy.
I wish, I would have to go there and understand, because there's so much confusion of what is happening in many countries in Latin America. I think in Chile was governed by Pinochet for years, and I think what they're demanding now is a rewriting of the Constitution, which is a similar problem to what happened in Brazil, is that we did not really reestablish a democracy after the end of the military dictatorship. The forces that were behind the dictatorship kind of were able to influence the writing of the Constitution in Chile for sure, and preserve privileges and structures that would kind of reinforce inequality. And that's what they're demanding to change. And I really feel for their plea, and I hope they will manage to be successful in that. And in Bolivia, it's so complex. In Bolivia, I would prefer to go there and understand, but Bolivia has gone through so many turbulences in the last decades, and I was thinking it was kind of a miracle that they were stable in a moment where the whole region is under such instability.
I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Petra, I'm sure we could talk for many hours about this. Everyone, Petra Costa, thank you very much.